Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 393 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I have a tribute episode for Carter Gillies, who passed away after a long battle with cancer just a few weeks ago. I discovered his blog in the early 2010s and became a regular reader. He was our Potter philosopher and often wrote about both the small and major questions of life. This episode is a re-airing of our 2014 interview where we talk about his theory about the 5 stages of learning. If you'd like to see examples of his work or read through the archive of his blog, you can do that at cartergilliespoddery.wordpress.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. And your background is interesting, and we talked about it a little bit, but about how you came here to study philosophy and ended up being a potter.
Yeah. I'm so glad I took this turn.
We talked about how philosophy is just so in your head. People have even described it to me as you can get deep enough that the earth floats away beneath your feet and you're just floating in space.
I'm very familiar with that.
So can you talk a little bit about studying philosophy?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm not really sure that's something that is that important to me anymore. But I think the reason I first moved into philosophy was that I had studied anthropology in my undergrad as a major and was really curious about the different ideas of what it means to be human. And it felt to me that a lot of the questions that they were asking were not really being answered very well. And that, in fact, in philosophy, some of the same questions had been asked and I answered a little bit better. So I kind of shifted my orientation from studying anthropology to looking at the questions from a more philosophical point of view. So I guess really my interest was in the nature of what it means to be a human. That led me to Athens.
Because the reason that I ask about your philosophy training is that I think you're one of the best thinkers and writers in our field in terms of your blog. Because many people read it. You're kind of like when we need to. I feel like when the blog community needs to go deep, you're where we go to go deep. And not every blog is like that. Like some blogs are mostly images, and that I feel like is a very light approach. And I think that that's great. I think we need both.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
I can totally tell in your writings that philosophy was important to you or important to the way you think, because you will write around the subject and give a sort of an explanation in 360 degrees.
That's exactly what I try to do. Yeah.
And that's so helpful.
Well, thanks. Yeah. I mean, as you can tell, I guess I'm still fascinated with, what it does mean to be human. And I think, especially from an artistic standpoint, creativity is really what helps define us as human beings quite a bit as well. So, yeah, so I think thinking about that kind of question is really something that I'm still very interested in.
And I love the idea that, like, when you were talking about thinking about being a human being, I think pottery is about being in a body. That it's all about the experience of the world through the senses. And of course, eating, taste, the touch, the weight,
Absolutely.
The smell of food. It's so much about the body. So how do you believe your philosophical, but also anthropological training led into you being a potter?
Well, that's actually probably not a direct line. It was certainly more direct going from anthropology to philosophy. But I think when I moved into pottery, it was actually as a break away from philosophy. Yeah, I had been studying, I guess, for about a year and a half into my PhD, and some friends who were in the ceramics department at the time decided that I needed a break from what I was doing in philosophy. I guess I was studying philosophy and was really very caught up in my own head, and the ideas that I was thinking about. But the problem for me was that I didn't really see what effect that had in the greater world, so it didn't really make a difference to anything outside myself. When the time came to do work in pottery, what I discovered was that even just working a little bit in clay made a difference. The world was now somehow different. And that was just an amazing experience, an amazing discovery for me. And I feel really grateful that I was able to take advantage of the time that I had in my studies for philosophy to actually do something that was not philosophical. So that break was definitely something that I needed at that time.
Because thinking about thinking sometimes is a rabbit hole, and I think actually the way this relates to a lot of potters is that they get critical of their objects, whatever they're making, their pots, their sculptures, their whatever, and then that criticism leads to criticism of themselves, and that is a broken loop of self-destruction.
Spiraling downwards.
Totally, because you can really think your way out of a great body of work because it's either not clear enough in the beginning, like you can't explain it. Therefore, somehow that lack of putting your finger on it maybe leads you into that self-doubt. Or you can just have one bad critique with someone, just one bad critique.
I've had those.
Totally. And so it's interesting to think about that relationship between the way we perceive ourselves and the objects that we make. And you being trained as a philosopher and an anthropologist, I think it's helpful to see that thinking is separate than doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also how we judge things, I think, is so dependent on where we're coming from. So if you put yourself in a different position with a different starting point, then where you end up can be entirely different. So, that gives you a little more freedom, I think, if you understand that.
Yeah, and I think it gives you permission to stop doing something for a while and change your starting point, and come back to it, because I swear there's this thing that happens in my studio where I'll make an object or a pot or even an image, and I won't have enough of that idea to start it, but I'll come back 5 years later, look back at my sketchbook or whatever I was looking at and go, I'm totally making that now.
That is a great perspective. I love that. Yeah, and I think the idea of permission is hugely important. You have to give yourself permission. And I think that also kind of leads to what you were saying about clarity. If you have too much clarity, then you're kind of stuck. You're not willing to actually look beyond that. I think, the more clear things are for you, the more you're kind of led by your convictions. And that actually is counterproductive to curiosity.
That's interesting, that relationship between conviction and curiosity, because a lot of times there's philosophies get people into making things. So like, for instance, people read Yanagi and learned about Minge, and then it was the philosophies that was first. Then the making was second. But that philosophy that he was writing about was so integral to Hamada and Leach actually making. Like it was their making that was fueling that. Even though he wasn't necessarily a maker, it was those connections, those conversations, and all of that. But if you start with a philosophy first, I think it's making those constructs that we work within maybe a little bit too rigid.
Yeah, you can build a fence around yourself. Yeah.
When you were in school at Georgia, you ended up coming back to do a master's in clay.
Yes.
And you told me about this amazing lineup of teachers you had. So can you talk about that sort of like 3-year period?
Wow. Yeah. I was in the right place at the right time for being a potter. Ron Myers was just about to retire when I first started taking classes. So some of my first exposure to clay was with Ron. And right after he retired, they were searching for his replacement. And in the year that it took to find his replacement, they had Michael Simon teach for a semester, Linda Christensen teach for a semester, Gina Bobrowski teach for a semester. It was amazing. It was an incredible experience.
And so those experience of switching teachers, at that point though, you had skills, you were a maker. But how did you reconcile these different philosophies of making and what they were talking about? Did you ever have trouble where you thought, this person said this, but in my head I can't reconcile that with what that person said, but I still like them both?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I was in a position where I understood that much about what I was doing. I was, I guess, still coming out of my time with philosophy and really just making pots because this is what I love doing. So, my motivation was almost entirely from the source of my joy about making pots, and thinking about why I was making pots was something that I had sort of abandoned at that point. So it's actually taken me a while to get back to the point where I could seriously think about what I was doing. But my first few years of making pots, it was pretty much the break that I needed from doing philosophy. So thinking with my hands basically was what I was allowing myself to do.
How did you feel like that your work developed during your MFA? Do you feel like you got more and more into intuition and therefore not thinking, or were you forced to write about what you were doing and insert the mind into the body?
I actually have to admit that I was probably not a very good graduate student in ceramics. And really, I was very confused about what I was doing and why I was there. I'm not sure I was entirely as well prepared for it as I should have been. And really, to be honest, it's taken me a few years after that experience to really come to terms with what I want out of clay and to really start to think those things through a little bit better. It was probably not the most easy experience for me to go through, to be honest.
At what point did you feel like you were comfortable in your own skin while making?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's something I noticed, I think, for many years, is that when I would actually take a little bit of time off from making, I would actually find that I've learned new things, that the time off actually was something that helped me, and that the more I was kind of nose to the grindstone, I would kind of lose sight of what I was doing. I'd be so caught up in the process that I wouldn't really know where I was anymore. So I think, that whole period was one that I didn't feel very comfortable with, what I was doing so much. But a few years later, what I discovered was that I could actually come back to making pots after, maybe a month or two off, and I would know exactly where I was. I would have, complete mastery of what I wanted out of the clay, and I could get there. It was a really great experience for me to discover that about my process, that I had been led to this area that I was very comfortable with.
Because I feel like because you write a lot about your thinking that you'll understand this question. But what are the dynamics, do you think, in our brains that are working when you are obsessively practicing a hand skill and then you stop and then later you have mental clarity? Like, how do you think that works?
Wow.
Because I've noticed that too. In fact, I'm in that right now because I took a break to build a studio. Right. And it was about maybe 3 or 4 months. And it was after a very intense studio session this summer. So this last summer. But I feel like that. Like I'm so much clearer now. But I don't know why that's happened. I just know that it has happened.
Yeah. Well, maybe it has something to do with that whole idea we were talking about with curiosity and confidence or conviction being on opposite sides of the spectrum. I just think that, when you're operating from a standpoint of what you know about the process and, working within that, you're sometimes maybe held up by what you do know. And if you take a break from that, then you're immediately thrown into a world where it's different. And, it's an area where you have opportunity now, and, possibility and potential is out there. So, it's a very different side of our being, that we can then explore. And it seems that, if you are kind of stuck in that one area of your expertise, then, you really aren't looking so much outside that. But if you give yourself the opportunity to step outside of that, then, just by, force of that procedure itself, you're opened up to a whole new realm. And I think, that really kind of points to a difference that I've been reading about recently, where, people can have two separate mindsets that they approach things with. One is a kind of fixed mindset, and the other is oriented towards growth. And I think that if you are kind of stuck in the fixed mindset, then you have limited yourself in a way that isn't very productive. But if you're in a growth mindset, then you allow yourself the opportunity to discover and to explore. And I think the fact of taking a break from yourself allows you to step into that other mindset.
That's so amazing, because that makes sense to me, that it's learning by comparison. That you're accepting the growth stage as a thought process when you stop the activity, because the activity is so engrossing. I think making pots is so physically demanding in terms of our attention that it might dominate the brain in a different way than, say, the growth stage, which is a reflective stage, which is a stage of sitting back and allowing sort of those puzzle pieces to slowly take shape.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of phrasing it.
And I think a lot too about how sort of the fight or flight syndrome goes into learning. If we can compare like making pots to running, when you're running, there's a certain level of thought that you have about anything that's happening. It can be meditative if you are running by yourself. But the moment that someone starts chasing you, even though you're doing the same activity, your brain goes into a different state because you go into fight or flight. Either you need to turn around and face that, or you need to keep running faster.
Right.
And it's interesting, the more you're in the flight stage where you're actually in a state of tension or fear, your level of thinking starts to drop to be very basic human processes.
Yes.
So things like body functions start to slow down, digestion starts to slow down, all these things start to slow down so that you can just exert as much energy as you can to get away from whatever's attacking you. And I think the way that applies to pottery making is that if you were doing in your studio the repetition of making and making and making, and tension is building because you have a show deadline coming up, your thinking is actually, as you get closer to the show, getting less and less productive because the fear is getting higher.
That's a great way of phrasing it.
And so your brain is actually starting to shut itself down. But then after the show, when the show's in the gallery and you're walking around with your friends and you're exhausted and you look at those pots, that's why I think you learn something different, because you're not in fear anymore, because it's already happened.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So everyone should take a break.
Yeah, that's a good lesson.
One of the things that I love about your process now is not only your pots, like we were out in the studio and I was saying about how I love this surface based on the way you're working, but also that you're very conscious as a blogger. So when did you start blogging? Like, when did all this begin?
I think it was maybe 3 or so years ago. And to be honest, it was not something I really even imagined I would be able to do. I'm actually very naturally a shy person, so it's kind of hard to put myself out there. But I had been paying attention to potters' blogs for a few years at that point, and I was actually encouraged to get the advice of a potter blogger, Scott Cooper. He seemed like the smartest guy out there, and that he would have some insight on some of the issues that I was dealing with at the time. So I sent him an email, and we've struck up this amazing conversation and friendship over the years. And if anyone's to blame for me blogging, it's Scott, as he encouraged me to do it. So,
I'm glad that he did.
Well, thanks. Me too.
And so those early, that would have been 3 years ago. It would have been 2014. So it's 2011, 2010, somewhere around there. That's interesting because you must have just started blogging and then just exploded in terms of like being able to really get it out there. I mean, I think about reading your blog. It must have been right around when you were starting then, because I started about the same time, like 2009-ish, somewhere right around in there. But what do you feel like you get out of blogging?
Well, and this actually may contradict a little bit of what we were just talking about before, but I think the process of blogging for me is a way for me to kind of figure things out. I don't actually have all the answers, but I've got questions, and the way for me to kind of figure out what those questions mean is to kind of stick some answers out there and figure out what actually makes sense. So for me, blogging is a way for me to think about the issues, and instead of sort of getting in this little rut where you're that focused, what it's been for me is actually kind of liberating, and it allows me to just pick up different thoughts and see where they lead. So for me, it's actually a great way to address topics that I'm interested in, to see what other people think. For a while, I was getting this great feedback and back and forth in the comment section, and I'm not sure why that has kind of tailed off recently, but for a long time, those conversations were some of the best experiences of my blog.
I always have that problem of getting people to continuously comment. And I think our blogs are very different. I think of myself being in the shallow end.
No, that's not true.
But in terms of you can casually read and casually leave. Do you know what I mean? As to where yours, I feel like when you're reading it, if they're going to comment, they probably have to stop and think about what you said before they write their comment. But it's interesting too, in terms of that idea of bringing people into your studio virtually. So, for instance, when you're writing about a topic that's interesting to you, and then someone comments on that topic, it is literally as if you are having a virtual connection to them being in your studio space.
Yeah, that's great. That's amazing.
It's invaluable.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine being a potter without that kind of resource right now. The community of potters is so generous, and just being able to, get on the computer and get in touch with someone that lives across the country is amazing.
We were just speaking before we got on mics about how you've recently kind of challenged yourself to reach out to more people and to different people.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, as I just mentioned, when I reached out to Scott Cooper to kind of get his feedback on some different ideas I was having, that was a hugely positive step in this direction, and definitely the most successful one that I've had so far. But I guess the thing that really interests me is that there are so many people out there who have similar ideas or are wrestling with similar issues. And, we're not alone. This is a community where people think about these things. So, what I've had to force myself to do is to be a little bit brave, a little bit courageous. And if it's someone that I respect and admire, then I am willing to put my foot in my mouth and embarrass myself, but, just to see what they think. And so I've contacted a lot of different folks that I've struck up conversations with, and it's been a lot of fun.
And how often do you get response back? Do you feel like you always get response back?
Not always, but I also realize that people are busy. They don't know who I am, so they're not really in a position where they feel they need to respond necessarily. It is amazing how generous people are, and if you show them that you're serious about what you're talking about, a lot of times they'll respond with the same kind of seriousness, and I think that kind of respect is really pretty amazing.
Because one of the reasons that I started the podcast, because it's really an extension of my blog, is that I couldn't get people to respond. I kept asking people to write guest posts.
Right.
And I found that when the act of writing, that was somehow, there was people were a little afraid, or maybe it felt like work. but talking doesn't feel like work. And that's why I like the podcast, is because like when you and I sit down, it's very easy. Like we're just talking,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I mean, some of there's no interface, like we're not interacting through the computer. So there is literally no work, it's direct thought out of our mouth to each other, which is kind of nice, but there's also something just maybe different about that.
Well, I do think it has a little bit to do with training. And I think especially these days, folks are much more adapted to expressing themselves on Facebook and Twitter, where the ideas are very compressed. So I think having an actual dialogue or an extended conversation on the internet is definitely not something people are really well adapted to, unless they really put themselves out there and try.
How do you feel like your readership has changed over the years in terms of like the actual numbers? Because I should ask, do you check numbers? Like, do you check stats about how many visitors you have?
Well, I used to be obsessive about it, but I really try not to look at it so much anymore. And to be honest, I'm not sure why I was obsessive about it, because I'm not really trying for any kind of popularity. But I guess I was just curious about it. I wanted to see who was listening. And I'm amazed at how wide that readership tends to be. It just kind of blows my mind. But I guess as a shy person, that's to be expected. I'm not always sure that what I've got to say is something that other people will be interested in. So it's kind of amazing that I've actually gotten the response that I've had.
Do you feel like that your blog has helped in terms of you communicating what your thoughts are and then other people receiving those thoughts and enjoying them? Mm-hmm. Has that changed your level of confidence in yourself, like in your day-to-day life? Or maybe in your studio?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how the blog actually relates directly to those things. I'd have to think about that some more. But I think certainly the feedback that I've gotten on the blog itself has increased the confidence I have in the blog as a medium for me thinking things through. I think there is definite positive in that.
I wanted to bring up a blog post that you had written that I've been thinking about ever since you've written it, and you were very nice to help me to remember exactly what you said because I couldn't find the post. It was about processes of learning, and you're a teacher as well as a potter as well as a blogger, so some of this comes from that. But there were 5 stages of learning, and I think I'm going to let you go through those and then maybe describe how you think that applies to clay.
Well, I think what I first really discovered about how we learn is that we actually have to learn how to learn first. We have to be open to, what things are possible. So, if you start out from a position where you already have your mind made up, then you're not in a position where you can learn. So learning how to learn is actually a first step. It seems like the next step from there would actually be that we have to learn how to think. Okay, and that's different from learning how to learn in the sense that thinking is sort of the application of different techniques or rules, and it's a means of getting from one place to another. So learning how to learn is sort of an openness, and learning how to think is a technique for getting from one place to another. The next step I would suggest is that you have to learn what to think. And typically what happens in that phase is that you're shown a lot of different endpoints that are possible. So, you're starting from here, where are you going to go? So, typically if you're taking clay classes, you'll be given a lot of examples of things to sort of aim for. So these are things that are used as models for what to think. And the next step would be that you have to learn how to think for yourself. And that means that you've taken all this knowledge that you've been given, and you have to kind of figure out what the next step is. Not simply repeat what you've been given, but come up with your own ideas. And the next level on top of that would then be that you have to really figure out what those ideas are. So it's not just thinking for yourself, but it's coming up with those ideas that matters. So that's kind of how I would describe it.
I remember reading that, and I think it was a series, right? You've referenced this a few different times in different blogs.
Yeah, I think I have.
Yeah, in different posts. But it blew me away because at the time I was thinking about sort of the neurological impact of learning, like what's actually happening in the brain when you are learning something, how we're making neural pathways, and how repetition and hand-eye skills create those neural pathways. But you, in 5 steps, described the nature of learning anything, not just clay, just the nature of learning how to throw a baseball, the nature of learning how to play a whole baseball game. It was like you were describing the human experience, as you said in the beginning. And I'm very interested in how you, as a teacher, have then been reflective on yourself in coming up with these 5 steps, and how that, and then in turn, has made you a better teacher.
I'm not actually sure I'm a good teacher. I mean, I try to be a good teacher, but I realize that, especially in the situation I'm in at the community center, the students are there for a variety of different reasons. And it's not just to learn how to work with the clay. A lot of the students are there because it's a needed break from their day. They may be there to socialize. So I can't actually have that straightforward an agenda that I have to lead them through. So my function as a teacher has to be much more adaptable than just kind of working towards that goal where they learn how to think for themselves and then actually come up with what to think about. So it's kind of hard. I think I also have to respect that each of these students has their own idea for why they're there.
I love craft center learning because there's the people there that just want to stop being a lawyer and make pots. But then there's also really serious students.
Yes, there are.
That's their first step into a lifelong, obsession with clay. But that sort of 5-step process applies to both of those groups. And as a teacher, I think it's hard sometimes to know when you really need to push someone individually, like you need to go farther, and when you actually need to back off from them altogether and just let them go through those stages themselves, which might take a long time, and it might not be equivalent to the time you're teaching them.
Yeah, the students that really have that ambition are the ones that I feel that I can help the most, because I feel like, I've got the experience to give them that kind of direction. But it seems that the students that are really there just, for their own enjoyment and not really with any greater ambition than just having fun, getting a few pots off the wheel, I really have to be more hands off and just let them explore what they're going to explore. As long as they're having fun, then, that is how they determine the success of their involvement. So I have to honor that pretty much.
One of the big pushes in academia is to have a curriculum and then be able to test that curriculum for an academic outcome so that there is a quantifiable period of learning and also a quantifiable amount of learning.
Right.
Boy, what do you think about that? Do you think that's successful as an actual learning tool?
Well, I mean, I think it fits pretty well into the idea that you have learned how to think and then also learn what to think, that first step of learning what to think. You're given the criteria for the grades, and if you measure up, then I think that is a legitimate step along the way. And what it seems to me, if I can sort of analyze this in terms of my own experience, is that I think when I was in grade school, maybe I was learning how to think. And in high school, I was maybe learning what to think. And in college, I was learning what to think or how to think for myself. And then in graduate school, I was learning what to think, having thought for myself. So I think, depending on what stage you are in your life and in your experience, these different stages are going to be appropriate for you. So, I mean, I think if you're not really ready to do a lot of thinking for yourself, just because you don't have a good background in what kinds of things are possible, then I think it doesn't really do you any good to think for yourself at that stage.
Yeah, like you're just not ready for the information. You're not ready to take that information and take it to the next level.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder about that a lot with undergrad education specifically, because when you're at that stage, when I was at that stage, I wasn't fully formed physically, I wasn't fully formed mentally, but I was taking in a lot of information, and it's interesting at 18, that's sort of that first mind. Well, I mean, some people get it in high school. I don't know if I did, but I feel like that in university, I had that experience of the world really opening up for me, where I was like, oh my God, this is a huge world. There's so much to learn.
Right. Absolutely.
But I wonder if you're 30 when you have that, in terms of if you have that breadth of information, how you digest that information would be totally different. Because at 30, you're fully formed. Your personality is different in terms of being more complete. Not that you don't change your whole life, but comparing an 18-year-old to a 30-year-old, there's a lot of changes in the body that make the learning process different. Right.
And actually, I think the 5 stages that I described, they're not separate, and they don't necessarily one follow the other. It's all sort of kind of thrown in together, and I think you're right, because we still do learn so many things about ourselves, and by changing, we also change how those things reflect on us. So, yeah. So I think it's it's definitely something that is. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, sorry, the cat meow got me going too.
Yeah, I think the more information you take in, the more information you have to enhance how you are able to think for yourself. And that, in turn, reflects on what things you then come up with as a result of that.
How does that process work for you now in terms of your continuing education as a maker? Because now, you're in your studio, you're by yourself, unless you invite a friend over. So it's a more solitary experience.
Well, it is and it isn't. And actually I think this way of talking about it really does shed a little bit of light, because I do try to be open to what other artists are doing. I really pay attention to what artists are making these days, and I'm just amazed at the variety and the quality that is out there. So, as all of this information is feeding into what I'm looking at, that in turn gets digested, and I start to, figure out how that relates to what I want to express. And, so it's this feedback loop where, I'm looking and I'm digesting and then I'm expressing. So I think that continues with each new bit of information that comes along.
Do you feel like intuition is a part of every one of those 5 stages, or do you feel like intuition is more valuable at the 5th stage, where there's some reflective aspect of your learning going on?
I think you're probably right that it has much more to do with that 5th stage. It does seem that the first sort of plateau where you're learning what to think has much more to do with what others are telling you, is important. And, that's sort of defined for you already. These are the goals. This is the criteria that you have to meet. And, that has much more to do with the sort of logical, rational following, from step A to step B. But I think you're much more involved in intuition when you're kind of making leaps that are, not necessarily a straightforward A to B, but, A to
K.
Exactly. So, so I think intuition is something you have to cultivate, and it's not something that, directly follows from, learning how to learn or learning, how to think. And it's certainly not learning what other people have to show you, but it's learning how to think for yourself, I think.
Do you think of curiosity as being sort of like the stepchild of intuition, or do you think they're two separate things? Because little kids are curious.
Yeah.
And they're curious and they're creative in an illogical way, which I enjoy.
Oh, me too.
Because they'll, purple dragons and railroad cars go together in their world. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that is a great observation because, at that point, the rules are not really written. It's very much open to interpretation. So I think, curiosity is, basically the openness to allow yourself to see things in different ways. And intuition is, a way that you make that jump, to that unknown.
This stuff is fascinating. And I don't often, actually, this trip, I've had some great conversations about intuition. I ask people about intuition all the time. Like it's one of my life questions, not always on mic, but just in general, because I'm interested in it. Yesterday, I was talking to a woman that teaches at UGA, and she said that the thinking mind is not, how did she put it? That the art you make from your thinking mind is not as successful as your intuition.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And I was not expecting an academic to say that, because I feel like not all academics, but the intuition, because it's so hard to quantify, is not as easy to have in an academic curriculum.
It's not as easily controlled. I mean, you don't really have the kind of predictive power of knowing what comes next.
So how do you think about that? Like, do you feel like that intuition, art that comes from intuition, is inherently different than art that comes from didactic communication, where you're doing A plus B equals C?
Well, I do think it's different. I don't know if it necessarily means that one is more successful than the other. I mean, I think you can achieve different kinds of success depending on what things you're doing. And it's not just limited to one or the other. But it does seem that the way of proceeding is so radically different between the kind of methodical planning out and the kind of just seeing what happens next and moving according to, the intuition of what things are possible. So, I think there's more risk involved in following your intuition, and maybe it's that the risk itself is something that leads to a greater potential for success. And for instance, if we're just following the kind of methodical, rational process of what we can kind of map out and plan out, I think we're kind of limited in what we can get because our imagination only goes so far. We can only see, what things are available to us. And that means that, any kind of success that we have is narrowly circumscribed by that. But if you kind of allow yourself to think outside of that and allow intuition to open those doors, then you can fail. You can fail greatly, but you can also succeed in different ways that were not, open to you otherwise.
One of the things that's hard to deal with as a potter is that we're making an object that's sold. A lot of times galleries or customers want reproducibility.
Right.
And how does that work into the grand failure in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think actually this is a good way to take this conversation, because I think it directly reflects what you were talking about with the flight aspect. Oh, right. Focusing. Because I think when you have that kind of pressure on you, and that pressure, in the selling market most often comes to a sort of predictability, where you have a signature style or you have some kind of conformity or coherence to the work that you make. I think that really kind of impedes your ability to find satisfaction and express yourself in sort of in intrinsic ways. You're sort of making more for the market rather than making for your own joys.
And do you feel like that making for the market, I guess one of the questions is, when you have that product line, that reproducible style, that's a necessity of making a living. But do you then break it down and say, this work is for selling and this work is for growing? Or do you just sell what you do when you grow?
I think that's a great way of talking about it. And I think that for the most part, many of us potters and artists in general end up on the side where we kind of box ourselves into this position because we need to make a living. And I think that a legitimate question is whether that's necessarily the case. I'm not convinced myself that it has to be that way. I do admit that, there are all of these outside pressures that really want us to kind of become that, become predictable. But playing the game according to those rules, it validates that way of looking at the world. And I think if you buy into that system, then you're kind of reinforcing it. And I just wonder if there aren't other options that we could have that don't require us to be that predictable. For instance, I think if you move in the sort of gallery world, there is that kind of pressure and it's very obvious. But I think if you explore opportunities outside of that, it becomes more of an open question because it's not something that's settled. So for me personally, I really have an aversion to boxing myself in. So I try not to limit myself in that way as much as I can. I try to be open-minded about what I'm making. And sometimes that means that the things that I make won't sell. And I kind of have to live with that. But the danger that is on the flip side of that is that if I only make the things that I feel will sell, then I've kind of forced myself into that box, and I'm not comfortable being there.
So is selling directly through the studio a way out of that? Or say Etsy, where there is no aesthetic? There's so much on Etsy that there's no expectation of reproducibility. Absolutely.
I mean, I think these are quite possibly, the alternatives to this way of operating. And this is why I'm absolutely fascinated with how the internet, for instance, has affected how potters are able to get their products to market. And it just seems amazing that, we've gone from a situation where, the consistency that's demanded by the marketplace is being slowly subverted by a customer base that doesn't have these same expectations. And I think we have to open ourselves up to that to figure out where this horizon is and where it's leading us. So for me personally, I enjoy the ability to express myself, according to how I want to express myself that day.
And I was thinking in terms of if the internet is a subversive way to get pots to market, if as that takes more sort of footing in society, if the consumer is then, their expectations will change. And then the galleries will then have to change to meet the expectations of the consumer. So therefore, the gallery system might relax. So not expecting someone to say, provide the same body of work for 3 years. Maybe it's the expectation is maybe 1 year. You might provide that same body of work to be sold in the gallery for 1 year. And then after that, it changes.
I sincerely hope so. That's. I think there's a lot of resistance to that because the sort of institutional perspective on art has been that the value of art is in the hands of gatekeepers, and the gatekeepers are interested in making their money. They have to make a living, and the way they do that is to market, especially to a selective crowd. And the way that the message of what they're selling is best reinforced is that there is this consistency that, Joe Potter is valuable because, his reputation is, it stands for something, right? And I think, this sort of vested interest in that conformity is very hard to break down. I mean, I think that, it is possible that this sort of openness that the internet has provided will be subversive, but I do think that, the function of gatekeeping that is in the hands of galleries is something that will probably always be there to some extent, just because there is a collector's market, and that collector's market really does depend on a product that is, up to standards, that meets expectations, that, the reputation, is based on. So, I think there's a tension between those two worlds that may bleed back and forth a little bit, but I'm not sure that we'll ever, that the dividing line between them will ever completely disappear.
Earlier, we were talking about pricing and how that plays into this. And you were saying that one of the things that was important to you is that children could buy your pots.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
You have a scheme of allowing them to buy it's half price of whatever the marked price is within a certain, realm, which is so different than a gallery selling to a collector that might be purchasing pots that are, $1,000. So can you talk about why that's important to you?
One of the things that is important to me is that we find a customer base that will understand what it is we're doing and appreciate what we're doing. And children are very accessible, or our art is very accessible to children because of their own creative nature. I mean, they're willing to explore, they're willing to be curious about things, and they accept creativity as a natural part of their lives. I think as we become adults, that is sometimes learned out of us, where we're taught that creativity is something that other people do, that, we are not creative ourselves, but we can consume creativity. So I think children have this natural connection to creativity that I think it's in our interests to encourage as much as possible. And I think if kids become familiar with pots, then they can accept that form of expression in their own lives. And, in the future, as they grow up, it won't be foreign to them. They will understand that pottery is something that can be appreciated.
And do you sell just your pots as you make them at a lower price, or is it that you make actual kid-size scale?
I make kid-size scale pots. I think I decided that, it was one thing for a kid to use an adult-sized pot, but there's no reason that I can't make pots that are specifically sized for kids' hands. So, so I spend quite a bit of effort trying to do that.
I'm sure you know Carol Epp,
yes,
who's a blogger. Makes an amazing body of work for children. Have you seen that?
Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah.
It is awesome. Like, I see so many of her pots that she puts on Instagram, and I'm like, oh man, I really want that pot. Like, it's interesting when your goal is children that somehow frees your own creativity, and I think that might have something to do with this concept of the inner child as talked about in psychology. Sometimes that is a little bit deep, but on a practical level, that concept of the inner child means that we all like to have fun in a childlike way. And all of us have an idea of what that is, whether that's like rolling around on the ground with our nieces and nephews, or whether that's making pots for children. There's some part of ourselves that I think enjoys that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it reflects the sort of innocence that, we can all enjoy. And the more we're surrounded by rules and restrictions and the things that we have to do to get by, the less that innocence really has a part in our lives. So I think you're right. It's definitely something to cherish.
I wanted to wrap up talking about your pots, the ones that you have, your collection, because you have so many beautiful pots. It's great also to see that your pots, a lot of are, wood-fired browns. But then the room we're in is really bright green. So can you talk about the pots that you find yourself attracted to, but then also the way you've chose to display them in your own home?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I agree that the pots that are in my collection are pretty much atmospheric fired, a lot of wood fired, some salt fired, some soda fired. There's not a whole lot of decorated pots, but there are a few that I really enjoy. It's hard to really pin down my aesthetic to just one narrow range. I think I'm accessible, or I think different kinds of pots are something that I can appreciate. This is a really hard question for me because the house really is so bright, and that's such a contrast to these round pots, but I don't really know why, to be honest.
But I could totally see this red glaze here, if that was this color green, but functioned the same way.
Sure. Yeah,
I could see that being on your pots, but I also see a lot of the sense of touch in your collection being similar to the sense of touch in your pots that you make.
That's true. Yeah.
And I'm always interested in the pot we buy because we need to learn from it. I don't know if we talked about that or not.
Yeah, briefly we did.
And that's great. I mean, I loved looking at my collection and then seeing a pot that was the most important pot for me for like 5 years. And then now it's not as important, but it's like seeing an old friend.
Right. Absolutely. I think you're right that all of these pots really do reflect a certain aesthetic that has been present in my own work quite a bit. And I think possibly the reason that so many of these pots are atmospheric fired is that my own history of pot making led a path through that. In grad school, I was mostly soda firing. And after grad school, I was able to fire in a wood kiln for a few years. A lot of this collection comes from that period in my life. I actually had a little bit more money to spend on pots. So the things I collected really came from that genre of pot making. It's interesting now that when I've moved to firing in an electric kiln, I do tend to glaze my pots with these really rich, deep colors. And that does seem to represent more the walls of my house, which are, kind of bright green, deep yellow, deep red. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm not strictly one thing or the other, but I've got these different sides to my personality, and I'm just thankful they go together pretty well.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do the interview.
Thanks, Ben. Me too.
I wanted to plug your website and maybe tell people where to find your work as well.
It's Carter Gillies pottery.wordpress.com, I think is the blog. And I think it's carterthepotter.etsy.com.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.